Welcome to today's Historical Explainer. I am so excited for this one because today we are unlocking a massive, honestly kind of baffling mystery from ancient India. We're looking at a forgotten emperor, a man whose story is sandwiched directly between two absolute titans of world history. Yet, somehow, he was the absolutely crucial figure who held an entire subcontinent together.
Okay, let's dive into this. When we look at the mighty Mauryan Empire, there are really two names that usually completely dominate the conversation, right? First, we have Chandragupta Maurya. He's the legendary founding father, the guy who brought it all together and unified the empire. And then, jumping ahead, we have Ashoka the Great, his world-renowned grandson, who expanded the borders and famously spread Buddhism far and wide. But what about that massive gap in popular history right between them? I mean, who was the ruler that actually kept this super fragile, newly formed giant empire from just falling apart? Well, the answer is Emperor Bindusara.
Section 1. A Mysterious Birth. A 2,300-year-old medical emergency. Now, before we can even begin to look at his reign, we absolutely have to talk about his birth, because, honestly, it reads exactly like a fast-paced thriller. Picture this. Imagine the Mauryan Palace, roughly 2,300 years ago. Chandragupta, the founder, was constantly a target for assassination. It just came with the territory. And the most common method of the time? Poison. So, to build up an immunity, tiny, non-lethal amounts of poison were secretly being mixed into his daily meals. It was a brilliant, albeit totally paranoid, defense strategy. Until one day, it went terribly, terribly wrong. The pregnant queen accidentally consumed the king's poisoned food. She collapsed. The royal physicians rushed in, instantly realizing she just wasn't going to survive the toxins. Literally a race against time. In a desperate, split-second bid to save the unborn heir, they performed what we would basically call today an emergency C-section. Against all odds, they safely extracted the baby. But the poison had just barely reached the child in time to leave a distinct blue mark, a bindu, right on his forehead. And that, believe it or not, is exactly how Emperor Bindusara got his name.
Section 2. Heir to the massive empire. A heavy burden.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly where our hidden figure fits. Growing up, you have to realize Bindusara carried a fantastically heavy burden. Imagine inheriting an empire that stretched all the way from the mountainous regions of the northwest, way down to the fertile plains of the Ganges. It wasn't just about throwing on a crown and sitting on a fancy throne. No, it was about keeping millions of diverse people, a massive standing army, and this highly complex, fragile administration completely intact. The crushing weight of this newly unified Mauryan Empire rested entirely on his young shoulders. Look at the generational timeline here. Generation 1, Chandragupta, the founder, built it from scratch. Generation 3, Ashoka, the expander, took it to its absolute limits. But right there in the middle is Generation 2, Bindusara, the guardian. He was the vital, absolutely essential bridge. Think about it. If this bridge collapsed, there would literally be no Ashoka the Great.
Section 3. Amritraghata, destroyer of enemies and southern expansion.
Now, you might be thinking a bridge ruler just kind of sits quietly, right? Just maintains the status quo. Well, not Bindusara. To foreign powers and local rivals, he was absolutely no weak link. In fact, Greek sources refer to him by a terrifying title, Amritraghata. That's a Sanskrit word which translates directly to destroyer of enemies. He didn't just passively defend his northern borders, he actively, aggressively pushed Mauryan influence further south into the Indian peninsula. He proved beyond a doubt he was a fierce military conqueror in his own right. But this duality is exactly what makes his reign so fascinating to study. On one hand, you have Amritraghata, the ruthless conqueror expanding his territory. But on the other hand, you have a deeply intellectual, surprisingly open-minded ruler. Bindusara's court was a total melting pot of ideas. He fostered an environment where incredibly diverse traditions and philosophical debates really thrived. He particularly supported the Ajivika sect. They were a group of ancient ascetics focused heavily on fate and destiny. He didn't just force a single, rigid ideology on his diverse subjects, he actually embraced the intellectual vibrancy of his era.
Section 4. Foreign diplomacy and philosophy, connecting with the Greek world.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that this intellectual curiosity extended way past India's borders. It's so intriguing to picture his advanced capital city of Pataliputra. It wasn't just some heavily fortified military hub, it was a sprawling, cosmopolitan center of foreign diplomacy. We're talking envoys and ambassadors from the Greek world, specifically from rulers in Syria and Egypt, acting as regular fixtures in Bindusara's court.
The Mauryan Empire was recognized as a global superpower, and Bindusara was actively engaging with the Mediterranean world. And there's this specific, honestly somewhat cheeky letter Bindusara sent to the Syrian king that I just love. He had three very distinct requests. He asked for sweet wine, dried figs, and, wait for it, a Greek philosopher. I mean, it's such a brilliant historical detail. A ruler with practically infinite wealth and a massive army isn't riding abroad asking for gold or weapons. He's literally asking for a thinker. It shows a massive, ravenous appetite for global intellect and philosophical exchange.
But the Syrian king's response? It's actually quite funny. He happily obliged with the first two requests. The sweet wine and the dried figs? Yep, packed up and shipped right over to India. But he firmly, absolutely drew the line at the third request, replying, Greek laws do not allow the trade of philosophers. Actually, scratch that. It was basically a polite way of saying, we don't sell humans. So Bindusara got his international snacks and drinks, but sadly, no imported thinker. Still, this incredible little exchange perfectly highlights the rich, cultural, and intellectual trade routes of the ancient world. Section 5. The Taxila Rebellion and Ashoka, facing internal challenges. So the crucial point is, managing a sprawling ancient empire wasn't all just, wine, figs, and philosophy. The real dangerous challenge for Bindusara came from within. Because as empires expand, those distant provinces often become incredibly difficult to control, and corrupt local officials, they can easily start abusing their power. This exact scenario began brewing in the vital northwestern trade city of Taxila. Discontent among the citizens there was rapidly, dangerously, turning into a full-blown rebellion. But look at what the citizens of Taxila actually said during this uprising. They explicitly stated, "Our protest is not against the emperor, but corrupt officials." This perfectly captures the administrative struggles of the era. The people weren't rejecting the Mauryan crown at all. They were just crying out for justice against local tyranny. It was a critical, high-stakes test of leadership for Bindusara. How do you respond to your own people when they are desperate, angry, but ultimately loyal? Well, Bindusara's response was incredibly wise. Instead of doing what most ancient kings would do, sending a massive, heavily armed army to crush the protest with sheer force, he dispatched his young son, Prince Ashoka, to handle the situation. Ashoka arrived in Taxila and, rather than immediately drawing his sword, he actually sat down and listened to the citizens' grievances. By addressing their very real complaints about those corrupt officials, Ashoka quelled the rebellion entirely through diplomacy and administrative reform. He brought total peace back to the region without spilling a single drop of blood. It was an absolute masterclass in governance, and importantly, it was the young Ashoka's very first test on the world stage. Let's move to and see how this builds the larger picture of his reign. 30 years. Think about that for a second. That is how long Emperor Bindusara maintained absolute stability across the massive Indian subcontinent. For 3 whole decades, he successfully defended his borders, managed incredibly complex internal politics, fostered rich international diplomacy, and kept the massive machinery of the empire running incredibly smoothly. Section 6. Silent Hero of History, the Legacy of Stability. Which brings us to the great, somewhat sad emotional irony of his life. It's exactly why he is the silent hero of history. Because Bindusara was so remarkably successful at keeping the empire from fracturing, his reign lacks the chaotic, desperate tales of survival. It lacks the massive, bloody, empire-forging wars of his father and his son. History books love drama, right? They love conflict. Because Bindusara gave his people peace and stability, his own story quietly faded into the background over the centuries. But we shouldn't for a second confuse peace with a lack of greatness. Bindusara's ultimate legacy is that he provided a safe, completely unbroken bridge. He inherited a colossal, newly born empire from Chandragupta. He nourished it, protected it from internal rot and external threats, and handed it over perfectly intact to Ashoka. Maintaining that perfect stability for 30 years was undoubtedly his greatest, albeit quietest, triumph. So it leaves us with this powerful question to ponder as we wrap up today's explainer. Are history's greatest heroes always the ones who conquer? The ones who leave behind huge, bloody battlefields and massive stone monuments? Or are they the silent heroes, the careful administrators, the guardians, the ones who quietly hold the world together so that the next generation can absolutely thrive? Bindusara definitely challenges us to rethink exactly how we measure historical greatness. Thanks for exploring this amazing story with me today, and hey, always keep questioning the history you think you know.